Now we begin with breaking news from the International Court of Justice at The Hague. It's ruled in favour of Qatar in a dispute with 4 Arab countries that have imposed a blockade on the Gulf state and have prevented Qatari aircraft from flying over their airspace. The court said the UN Civil Aviation Agency has jurisdiction in this case.
The court, 1, unanimously rejects the appeal brought by the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Arab Republic of Egypt, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. 2, by 15 votes to 1, holds that the Council of the International Civil Aviation Organization has jurisdiction to entertain the application submitted to it by the government of the State of Qatar on 30 October 2017, and that the said application is admissible.
Well, it all began in June 2017 when Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt severed ties with Qatar and imposed a land, sea and air blockade. Doha then called on the International Civil Aviation Organization to declare the air blockade illegal. But the blockading countries challenged that move, suggesting the UN agency didn't have jurisdiction to handle the dispute. But in 2018, the agency rejected that claim, insisting that it does have jurisdiction, a move in Qatar's favour. The blockading countries then turned to the International Court of Justice, asking it to re-examine the issue of jurisdiction. It's now ruled in Qatar's favour once again. It paves the way for Doha to possibly sue the blockading countries for compensation or find other ways to end the air blockade. Now, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt accuse Qatar's government of supporting terrorism, allegations without evidence that Doha has strongly denied. The air restrictions imposed 3 years ago affected several major flight routes that passed through the airspace of the blockading nations. It forced Qatar Airways to make longer detours and use limited alternate flight paths. Qatar says the airspace restrictions by Saudi Arabia and the UAE are a clear violation of international law. Now, Step Vassen has been covering this story for us at The Hague, and she's joining us live. This was an extremely complex case, Step. If you can, just talk us through what was happening in court.
Well, legal experts here call it a very confident verdict, in the sense that it was a very clear verdict. I think many here had expected that some of the appeal might have been rejected and might not have been rejected. It comes down to 2 cases that have been filed by the 4 countries against Qatar. It deals with a Chicago Convention from 1944, but also an air services transit agreement also signed in 1944. Both agreements deal with the same issue, which is a freedom of movement between countries in airspace. So basically a country is allowed to fly into another country's airspace, exactly as Qatar has wished would happen. Qatar, as you said, has filed this case at the ICAO Council, and the countries have appealed against this verdict. Now the President has explained at length that the Chicago Convention, signed by most nations in the world, that this is a very right convention to use, that it deals exactly with this issue that Qatar is dealing with now, because the 4 countries had said it wasn't the case. They said this is a security issue dealing with terrorism. It has nothing to do with aviation. So the President has made clear that it has to do with aviation. Also, another appeal, a part of the appeal was about the negotiations. The countries had accused Qatar of not doing enough to come to a diplomatic settlement before taking the case to the ICAO Council. Now the President here at the court has decided that Qatar did everything it could to make all the diplomatic efforts possible to avoid going to the ICAO Council, even until the last minute, the President said, but it was very clear that the countries were unwilling to reach this settlement. So on all accounts, this appeal was rejected. It means now that the ball is back with the ICAO Council, who now has to really go into the content of the case and make a ruling about this air blockade. So experts here are telling me this could unfortunately still take a couple of years, but now, for now, of course, this is a very positive outcome for Qatar.
Let's step Vasan live for us in The Hague. I want to talk to Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, Marwan Basharat, who's here with us in Doha. The obvious question, of course, Marwan, is what does this mean for the eventual lifting of the blockade? Because this was always seen as a key step in that.
Well, absolutely. As we've heard from our correspondent, it's going to be a question of time. And usually with international organizations, with UN organization, it's quite difficult usually in terms of a frustrating process moving forward because the bureaucracy is quite cumbersome and usually states have lots of leverage. Now, whether ICAO will actually be able to enforce the thing sooner than later remains to be seen. But the fact that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are members of the International Civil Aviation Organization, it means that eventually they're going to have to come to terms with its ruling. And that actually goes to a lot of other aspects to this conflict here in the region. But Abu Dhabi and Riyadh have been adamant. They have been stubborn. They have failed to admit their failure, if you will. And hence, they won't even accept a Trump administration initiative in order to sit down with the Qataris and figure this thing out on the basis of an American initiative. All in all, this was an important cornerstone, an important day. And the fact that one UN arm told the UAE and Saudi Arabia that another UAE arm that is already seen this brief to have the jurisdiction to rule on it, I think that's huge, that's important. But as you said, we're going to have to wait and see how does this reflect on other aspects of resolving the conflict.
One of the key elements of the ruling that the court made was the fact that in the initial representations, there had been apparently no effort on negotiation on the part of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Egypt. In order for this to progress, is there any hope, do you think, that some sort of negotiation might open up and that might lead to a path towards more talks?
Just to remind our viewers around the world that the blockading countries imposed 13 conditions, or rather preconditions, for sitting down with the Qataris. And as almost everyone in the international community, including Paris, London, and Washington, that looked at these conditions have said, in the words of then foreign minister or Secretary of State Tillerson, that these were basically ridiculous, that they were not enforceable, that were not realistic, and so on and so forth. And just to remind our viewers around the world is that one of those conditions was closing our own network, Al Jazeera, that is based in Qatar. So really, the idea that Qatar could have negotiated with these countries when these countries have put preconditions that basically are surrender makes it all, too unrealistic to blame Qatar for not going into negotiations. That's one. Two, I think what we've heard the last few days about an American initiative to bring the parties together, on the basis of something that's reasonable and pragmatic, that was rejected, according to Fox News, the American president's favorite network, that was rejected by the UAE in particular, that convinced Saudi Arabia to walk away from the American initiative. That really tells us that the blockading countries feel uncomfortable even sitting down with their favorite ally, the United States, the Trump administration, in order to figure this thing out. Clearly, and in sum, after 3 years of failures, it seems that Abu Dhabi and Riyadh are finding it ever too difficult to just admit their mistakes, admit their failure, and try to work for a better future for this region and for this Gulf Cooperation Council.
Is there any suggestion, Marwan, that this ruling, given the fact that, as you say, that we have to be aware that these things do take time, particularly with international law, at the same time, this ruling does give a degree of leverage on the part of Qatar in terms of strengthening the amount of international opinion, if you like, with regard to whether or not the blockade should be withdrawn?
Absolutely. And, I'm completely open about this. I myself had to get some legal advice, if you will, about the legal aspect of this thing, because I definitely understand the political implications and why this is a very important step forward for Qatar in terms of, unblocking, if you will, the blockade. But clearly, the fact that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt are part of ICAO, they are part of the International Civil Administration Organization, it means that they're going to have to abide by its rules. The fact that they tried to escape that by running away to the International Criminal Court, of course, or Court of Justice, did not add much to their gimmicks. And at the end of the day, this has really blown up on their faces. It went back to the International Civil Administration, and we know where it's leaning. So now the question is whether they will preempt any punitive action on the part of the various UN arms in order to act, or whether they will wait until they are totally embarrassed, with a total dress down by the United Nations various arms for them to do something. I suggest, and it seems like everyone else suggests around the world, is that Saudi Arabia and the UAE needs to get with the program. They need to really admit their failure. They need to listen to the United Nations Civil Aviation or International Court of Justice, and just basically lift the blockade, because it is really a waste of time, waste of energy, and frankly, it's a lot of global warming for all these airplanes that just have to go through over Iran in order to go back south, and so on and so forth. It's just been a terrible 3 years. It will be great for everyone if they just listen to the International Criminal Court, if they would listen to the International Civil Aviation and accept the ruling and lift the blockade.
It's Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, Marwan Bishara. Marwan, thank you very much indeed.